On a clear day, you can see fortifications. You can see the harbours. You can see the fleet. You can see the city the fleet created. You can see the tars, the tarts, the cranes. Since this film is partly about the French threat, you should be apprised that the word for crane and the word for tart is the same. La grue. There, you've learnt something already. Portsmouth is a former one-industry city, and that industry was the Royal Navy. The dockyard is its home.
Fire station, our own church, our own private residences, which nobody knew about. There is a whole treasure trove of wonderful buildings to be absolutely discovered.
Portsmouth has always been at the sharp end of history. If you've lived here over the centuries, you've always had a seat in the stalls when it came to watching the boats going out to claim various bits of the world, to paint them pink, to defend them, to defend the trade routes. And I think to that degree, violence, state violence, martialness is in the blood and it's in the bone.
Defence is famously the best form of attack, just as attack is famously the best form of defence. Is there really much difference between defence and attack? Both stratagems are equally susceptible to cock-ups. Both can equally get lucky. The kinship between the defensive and the offensive is made explicit in the way that the War Office was incorporated into the Ministry of Defence. No government has ever shied away from the power of euphemism or from the tonic magic of a name change. But this particular change was made under Harold Wilson's first administration. Wilson had the courage to stand up to the then US President, Lyndon Johnson, and keep us out of Vietnam. We were, at that point, 4 decades ago, governed by a generation which had witnessed war at first hand and considered it a last resort, a failure. So maybe that name change was not merely cosmetic. Maybe it was a declaration of intent. Maybe it was a non-patrician way of saying that jaw is better than war. Maybe it was intended to herald an age of diplomacy. Portsmouth, uniquely in Britain, possesses a gamut of buildings which exemplifies the uncertainties and shifts and ambiguities of this nation's attitudes to belligerence and pacificity, to its wayward allies and trusted enemies, to jingoistic hubris and perceived threat, to Johnny Foreigner in his many mysterious forms. I say this nation's. I mean, of course, this nation's governments, of whatever sort. The reason that Portsmouth has been so sure an expression of governmental thought is that a naval structure or a military structure, any martial structure, is unmediated. It represents the will of a particular regime. The middleman is cut out. I made a slip of the tongue, incidentally. Governmental thought? No. Thought is not the right word to use when governments are liable to include people of the calibre of Mr. Jeff. Like I was saying, the middlemen are cut out, always have been, always will be. There is no trade, no industry, no profession which is so immune to the solaces of architectural design as the armed forces, the services, who do the government's bidding without question. The ramifications of their neglect of architecture are manifold and confusing. This dockyard administration block, built a decade and a half ago, only goes to show what happens when the services attempt architecture with a big A. It's too insipid to be pretentious, it's too half-baked to be kitsch. How can they get it so wrong? How can they get it so wrong so often? You suspect that Jolly Jack Tar and Johnny Pongo don't quite know how to conduct themselves on Civvy Street. It appears that the surfaces can't come to any accommodation with building types which aren't specific to them. Architecture is a condition of civilization, an agent of civilization. Sure, it provides shelter, but beyond that, it possesses multiple purposes. The style which arrived in Britain in the 1930s and which dominated much of the latter half of that century might be called functional, but that's just a name, like 2-hour dry cleaners. It's no more or less functional than any other idiom. A work of architecture is multiply expressive. It sends out countless signals, which may be contradictory. Architecture is self-conscious in its pursuit of beauty or piety or jollity or gravity or fantasy or delight, most usually in pursuit of a mix of those. Architecture is a means, perhaps the supreme means, by which man shows that he is a maker, who, moreover, makes for the sake of making. An impulse which is quite absent here. Everything in the dockyard is made to fulfill a particular task. Everything is for something. This is true functionalism. It has nothing to do with an exercise in a style. These objects are tools. They differ from the sort of tools that DIY buffs keep in their shed, only in size and in site specificity. A dockyard on this scale is a factory, a service station, a store, a workshop, a foundry, an arsenal. It is an industrial site. Boats are built here. They are serviced, repaired, maintained, painted, fed, fueled. At one time, Portsmouth Dockyard was the largest industrial site in the world. It is a town within a town, an organism, a boat hive, a multifaceted piece of machinery. This dockyard raises questions about the very nature of buildings. What are buildings? Or perhaps that should be, which are buildings? Is a warship a building? It's certainly a structure, and one wrought with a technological acumen that few land-borne structures enjoy. Equally, is a dry dock a building? I'm pondering these matters because the relationship of what appear to be unequivocal buildings in the dockyard, things, that is, with brick walls, with roofs and doors and windows, The relationship of these with epically proportioned pieces of equipment begs the question of whether they really are buildings. Or whether, like transporter bridges, locks, dry docks, floating docks and cranes, they're installed tools, heavy-duty bits of kit, Britain's best bits of kit. Buildings, structures, kit. That the classifications are unclear might seem strange, for are not the services hierarchical? Does not everything have its place? Is Portsmouth not the city where the journalist Fred Jane founded the Defence Anorak's Bible, Jane's Fighting Ships, which applies a quasi-scientific taxonomy to vessels? But the impulse to classify, to create order, is just that, the expression of a human need, rather than a response to a particular phenomenon. How, for instance, do we classify the persistently blurred borders between water and land? They do not seem separate, but complementary, overlapping, mutually dependent. Elements run into each other. They create elisions which defy classification, but which have a notable appeal to painters, to English painters, and to practitioners in that most English medium, watercolour. The most magnificent of Portsmouth's dockyard structures are those of the late 18th and more especially 19th centuries, the point at which the British Navy was at its mightiest. The point, too, when Portsmouth achieved a paramountcy as a naval base, due largely to the direction that the perceived threat, indeed sometimes real threat, to this country was coming from. The threat from Holland, which had been ever present in the 17th century, abated after William of Orange succeeded to the British throne. Thenceforward, France was the enemy.
The 18th century, a glorious age in the history of the Navy, whereon, under the good providence of God, the wealth, safety and strength of the kingdom chiefly depends. An age in which the men of Portsmouth can call their town the glory and bulwark of our kingdoms. A royal dockyard.
Of the great naval bases, Portsmouth was reckoned to be the best place to counter the French threat. So naval power accrued here. And that power is represented by buildings whose strength and nobility are very different from those of, say, a palace. They're not built primarily for show, which is no doubt the very reason why they so impress us. They form a group unique in Britain. They're stately despite themselves. Their muscularity and austerity are part of their integrity, not optional add-ons. Can we be sure of this? Although there can have been no intention to lord it over the public, there was the immense workforce in the dockyard, and there were sailors home from sea whose first sight upon disembarkation would have been this summation of imperial might. For about half a century from the 1840s, the dockyard's designers, engineers remember, adopted an idiom which architects themselves shunned. This was the idiom of John Vanbrugh. These structures comprise one of the finest concentrations of 19th century industrial building to remain extant in Britain. Vanbrugh's case is an oddity. In a field of endeavour where plagiarism and copyism are the norms rather than the exceptions, this extraordinary artist had few followers in his lifetime, and none of them of more than parochial importance. His greatest building commemorated a victory over the French. He himself had been a prisoner of the French. His only son to survive childhood died in battle fighting the French. Though that, admittedly, was 19 years after his own death in 1726. More than a century on, his uncompromising style, which he himself described as heroic and masculine, would at last be revived for two purposes: dockyards and prisons.
Think of the whole dockyard itself as a body, the dock pumps have got to be the heart. Probably takes between 3 and 4 hours to pump a dock, depending on the size of it. We can actually pump 26,000 tonnes an hour, which equates to 7 tonnes per second. But you've got 3 miles of interconnecting tunnels, basically what we call culverts. They run the length and breadth of the naval base, and basically they feed the dock pumps with water as we pump the docks out. The tunnels, or culverts as we call them, were built by civil engineers. Basically the tunnels are 6 foot round, they're brickwork. The uniqueness of them is the length. Most dockyards have got culvert systems, but not the size of this one. It's the most complex in the world. The only way to get knowledge is actually to walk the system, which I have done over a series of years. Probably 4 years to really get to know it, know the ins and outs. The brickwork down there is fantastic. Most of it's been there 100 years, and it's as good now as the day it was put down there. We do a lot of maintenance on what's called penstock doors, which are the gates that actually shut the docks off and shut the culverts off. They're big steel structures driven by a screw, and we have to go down occasionally, grease them up or survey them. I think the craftsmanship is brilliant, no doubt about it. To prove it, they're still standing now. How many other buildings can you say that are constantly underwater will still be up in 100 years' time?
The former fire station possesses an early example of a cast iron frame. It supported a water tank, a sort of rooftop reservoir. Its walls are of corrugated iron, a recent invention and not yet widely used. Today, corrugated iron, like pebble dash and raw concrete, is at the bottom of the pile of building materials. This was not always the case. In the late 19th century, it was the material of the future, the stuff of tomorrow. But yesterday's tomorrows are the cul-de-sacs of broken dreams. Boo-hoo. Corrugated iron, like tower blocks, requires maintenance. Only the services practiced in dealing with such industrial materials seem to have understood this. But such technologically advanced structures are atypical. The Navy seldom applied the devices and materials which it had developed for its vessels to its land-borne structures. The gulf between Victory, launched in 1765, 40 years before Trafalgar, and Warrior, launched a century later, is chasmic. The gulf between industrial sheds of those years is narrow. At sea, wood gave way to iron and sail gave way to steam. On land, brick gave way to brick. While ship design advanced and the docks themselves expanded, landborne structures suffered a sort of stasis, which is what makes them so special, which is what keeps them so separate from the mainstream. The imperviousness to fashion meant that the dockyard is, for instance, free of the evangelical Gothic revival buildings, which sought to turn Britain into a sort of theocracy. The appeal of the dockyard church of St. Anne's is that it's of an epoch when Anglicanism was uncontaminated by too much religion, when reason was a virtue.
I remember the first day I came into the dockyard. It was way back in the early 50s. And I walked from the main gate to the main office, and it was like being at market day. You were being pushed and shoved and jostled. But now you can walk around the dockyard quite openly. It's almost like a Sunday walking around the dockyard at times. We've lost all the people that worked in there. Historians now talk about the quaint craftsmen that worked in the dockyard. Their old-fashioned tools, making ships or ladders and masts. Nothing quaint about it. It was hard work. It was dirty. And it was cold. Most of the time it was uncomfortable, and often it was dangerous. We tend to forget the nasty side, which we shouldn't do, because it's all part of our history and heritage. We're actually very proud of it, and we can lay claim to be the oldest naval base still doing the same job on the same site. All the major development of dry docks is centred at Portsmouth. The oldest stone dry dock which we still have is here in Portsmouth, with General Bentham inventing the ship-shaped caisson, which is the thing that sits in the end of the dock and seals it. The first one was built here in Portsmouth. So you can see that we really were the cutting edge of technology for its time.
Is it appropriate to apply the epithet utilitarian to those many structures which are contemptuous of applied style? I wonder, because the most influential and inventive naval engineer of the early 19th century was Samuel Bentham, brother of Jeremy Bentham, the now mummified philosopher and reformer, whose utilitarian doctrine was to achieve the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The younger Bentham's inventions exhibit that aspiration. Buildings which are fireproof, a feature of his brother's panopticon. Block-making circular saws powered by steam, which, wrote a contemporary, eclipse all rivalry. Dredgers powered by steam, which enabled vessels of ever deeper drafts to be built. He created the recoilless gun and the caisson, a sort of sinkable and floatable shell which can be fitted about a vessel under construction or repair. These devices, subsequently adopted in merchant shipyards and widely adapted, were intended to both increase efficiency and to alleviate the worker's lot. The latter claim has, of course, been made for every invention from the wheel to the computer. The
relationship between the town and the dockyard has always been very important, obviously. If you look at all the old sepia photographs when the dockyard was booming, and we're talking about the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, then you had tens and tens of thousands of dockyard workers. That's all gone now. But without the dockyard, there wouldn't be a Pompey. I mean, it's as simple as that. There was a wonderful story about the dockyard wall. I always thought that the wall was built around the dockyard to keep people out. I now realise it was actually built to stop pilferage to some degree. There used to be a thing called chippage, and people working in the dockyard, no matter what they did, were allowed to take bits of wood out of the dockyard as long as they weren't longer than 3 feet. And if you go around Portsea, even now, the number of windows that are exactly 2 foot 11.5 inches is quite extraordinary.
Without rope, a sailing ship wouldn't be able to work. It depends on all its ropes, and it depends on the men to be able to maintain those ropes. On something like the Warrior, we've got miles and miles. I would say about 4,000 to 5,000 miles of rope. Most ropes on a ship are long, so we don't want to keep joining them together. If we join ropes together, that makes a weakness. The ropery is 300 metres long. So having a nice long length of rope come from the ropery, we know that all the way down that length of rope, it is the same strength.
Coleridge, the aesthete, described the forging of a man-of-war's anchor in the dockyard as truly sublime. Coleridge, the moralist, added, "The poor men are pitiable slaves. From 4 in the morning, they work till 9 at night. They become old men in the prime of manhood." He imagined this ropery as a Hindustan cavern. Again, he tempered his wonder with the observation that a newly installed pin machine eats up the rope men like giant in a fairy tale. Yet this building, despite its exceptional length, seems curiously villagey, almost domestic. In scale, that is, not in size. It is 300 metres long. It belongs to the very first years of industrialization, to a point where there was not yet a separation between home and workplace. And nor was there a separation between the architecture of home and the architecture of workplace. A specific type of factory or workshop architecture had yet to be founded. This collision of domestic scale with quasi-industrial size produced captivating structures, such as these storehouses, which might be the homes of an ambitious apothecary, a well-to-do corn merchant, a tricky lawyer. The point is that at this stage, despite these being single-issue buildings tailor-made for a specific purpose, they don't reveal what that purpose is. They wear a mask of discretion. They're deadpan. The Georgian ideal was far from expressive. It was to achieve front, literally, to display architectural good manners, to exhibit formality. Again, this is a martial property which came also to inform civil architecture and urbanism. There's an evident analogy with uniforms, which quash individuality and foster cohesion and subservience by emphasizing role, which subsumes personality. The sailor and the soldier are machines. They're an integral part of the apparatus of belligerence. They are themselves weapons, albeit ones that are cheaper than munitions. They are transformed by uniforms into numbered units. When they put on kit, they become kit.
I've been involved with making uniforms for 32 years. I don't know where the time went. My husband started this business, and this has changed a lot. There used to be 37 along this road during the war, and one after the other they closed. Now there are just 2 left. Well, the Navy has shrunk a lot, of course, you see. That's the main thing. The uniforms never change, that's one good thing, you know, they always stay the same. Shirts, shoes, everything stays the same. You start with 1, which is sub-lieutenant, then you get 2 with, that's 2, that's a lieutenant, then you have 2.5, that's a lieutenant commander, and then you have 3 full ones, that's a commander, and after that you go high up. I think the uniforms are very smart, but they look impressive to me. The evening wear, of course, it's very, very smart. Very figure-hugging and very, very nice. Girls all fall for it.
Dockyard structures are blue-collar. They're dressed in, so to speak, work clothes, in overalls. They're big sheds. Their potency derives from their singular resolve. They're bereft of architectural niceties, which might be counted a tradition here, a tradition which the later 20th century adhered to, but without conviction. The mannerisms of industrial building had by then been appropriated by civil architects, just as the bourgeoisie had appropriated denim jeans and heavy boots.
Which really brings us back to where we started, the tricorn in the heart of Portsmouth, the high-rise that everyone has a low opinion of.
Oh, I think it's terrible. Dreadful.
Really horrible.
Shopping centres, theatres, collegiate buildings, they all got tough. It was, of course, just a look, no more, no less. The industrial aesthetic has precious little to do with industry. It's an affectation derived from pillboxes and blockhouses, warehouses and pumping stations. It's surely fitting that the most spectacular instance of this architectural mode should have been in Portsmouth. Martial building may be indifferent to civil building, but the opposite doesn't apply. Portsmouth's defensive buildings, such as the fortresses on Portsdown Hill above the city, have no equivalents in the civilian world. Barracks and messes, wardrooms and guardhouses, ramparts and caponiers, gun emplacements and musketry galleries. These structures are certainly buildings, but they're habitually considered to be outside the canon of architecture. They are indeed seldom the work of architects. They're marginalised. They belong to a hermetic and insular tradition. They're so ingrown they're tectonic verrucas. Military and naval architecture, if architecture is an admissible epithet, Military and naval architecture has developed in a seemingly parallel universe. It's oblivious to shifts of style and ideology, material and scale. Shifts which afflict churches, cinemas, schools, pubs, houses, hotels. Architecture is in perpetual mutation. It develops. Offensive and defensive structures are the exceptions. They're anomalies. They doggedly refuse to abide by the rules which govern the practice and development of sacred and civilian architecture. Belligerent architecture is afflicted by arrested development. It's primitive. It suggests that humankind is at a rudimentary stage of evolution. You might say that war itself suggests the same. Structure composed of labyrinthine tunnels recalls sets, lairs, warrens, the dwelling places of beasts, which beasts are obliged to build for themselves. Beasts have no choice but to cut out the middle beast. So when humans wage war, we slip down the scale. We are debased. We revert. We become temporary beasts, coarse, primal, fearful, aggressive. We do not live, we merely exist. We demonstrate that even the most supposedly civilized people possess an aptitude for atavistic hatred of the other. And if we don't possess it ourselves, we can be enjoined to hatred by belligerently evangelical politicians who turn themselves into tribal warlords. They attempt to foment in us a collective memory of backwardness and vengeance, and attached to that memory is the memory of burrows and caves. The identification of human with machine is most complete when both are camouflaged. Camouflage works best when it can obey G.K. Chesterton's rule of where best to hide a leaf, on a tree. But a ship is not made of sea, and a boat shed is not made of sand. One of the Second World War's most distinguished camoufleurs, increase your word power, was Professor Sir Hugh Cott, the Cambridge zoologist who wrote Adaptive Coloration in Animals, which remains to this day the classic text on mimicry. However, camouflage is not a science, nor though is it an art, despite which numerous artists have been invited to devise schemes. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Roland Penrose, Grant Wood, author of the endlessly parodied American Gothic, and Edward Wadsworth, whose entire career might be said to derive from his work on dazzle ships during the First World War. Marine camouflage is absolutely no defense against radar, infrared detection, heat-seeking devices, and so on. So why doesn't today's Navy just own up to the fact that camouflage is redundant and let its hair down and paint its warships in very scrumptious colours like mandarin and blush aubergine? Or excitingly vibrant houndstooth, or gingham, which is just so zeitgeisty at the moment and which just screams out, "Hello, midshipmen, let me show you my mizzenmast." Why not? because to do so would be to miss the point that defence's job is now crudely psychological. It always was to a degree. A defence is only incidentally designed to repel or deceive the enemy, whoever the enemy might be. Its purpose is reassurance, both of the civilian population and of those who man the defences in a state of obedient self-delusion. In 1940 and 41, countless railings were torn out of London's streets and squares as part of the war effort. They were, it was announced, to be melted down and forged as weaponry. In fact, what happened was that they were dumped in the Thames estuary off Sheerness. Still, this act of casual vandalism was reckoned to be a great morale booster. Portsmouth is the most lavishly defended city in Britain. Does it then follow that its populace feels safer than that of, say, Southampton? Maybe. But its defences are for the entire nation. We can all sleep easy because of them. The realm defends its loyal subjects. It has to defend them, for who else will defend the realm? It was always thus. There was always a flawed compact between the state and its potential cannon fodder. The state conscripts or press gangs. It persuades the people of imminent danger. It persuades them that Armageddon is a mere 45 minutes away.
Rome sends her legions into the furthest corners of the discovered world, and her ships are crowding English waters. Some of them are pushing up into a lonely creek on the south coast of Britain, in Hampshire. In this natural harbour, a fort is built.
Portsmouth physically charts the history of British xenophobia. It's an anthology of responses to scares. It's a monument to diplomatic failures, to the persistence of nationalism, to unneighbourliness, and also to royal covetousness and the boorishness of the state. Portchester Castle established the template, not merely for the fortifications themselves, but for the unlovely state of mind and conduct that they represent. It was originally Roman, one of the Saxon shore fortresses. It is, however, not on the seashore, but on that of the northern side of the harbour. Like many of its successors, it was apparently intended to defend the harbour against attack from land. Most of what remains today is of the 12th and 14th centuries. What does not remain is the Augustinian monastery, which occupied part of the outer bailey. The dissolution of the monasteries was undertaken not merely to quash papal power in this country. It was also an act of grand larceny, a state crime of exceptional proportions. Land and buildings and treasures were plundered by the crown and sold to courtly sycophants and ambitious placemen. This was the foundation of such great estates as Wilton. And Henry VIII used the money that he had thus acquired to build a series of fortresses to repel the enemies he had made, establishing the first church of the obese polygamist, now trading as the Church of England. Portsmouth is a bastion which contains bastions, a Russian doll of a place. There are fortresses everywhere. They're extraordinarily public. They advertise their massive and now incongruous presence. They're reassuring in a way that an invisible electronic device could never be. Humankind's perception of the means of defence is nowhere near so advanced as our invention of those means. We respond to the physical, to the literal. The graphically fortified and the visibly tough appeal to our primitive senses. So barbed wire, Rottweilers and human apes with no necks will always have it over hidden gadgets.
Know anything about them. I mean, as far as I was concerned, I've been brought up here all my life, but as far as I was concerned, it's just a pile of bricks with grass on top. You know, it was just, they'd just always been here. The thought of actually living in it just never occurred to me. Well, I was through my interest with medieval longbows. I needed to do some research, and there was some archive here that I needed to look at. And I got to know the custodians, and she mentioned that the flat was coming available. So I put my name down and got it. It's got an atmosphere about the place that's unlike anywhere else. And once you've been involved with the place, I think anybody that's involved with it closely, you kind of fall in love with the place a little bit. You can be as loud as you want. You've got no neighbours to worry about. Play music as loud as you like. And probably the worst thing is front door keys.
This unparalleled concentration of fortresses is a monument to several centuries' Francophobia. Here is fear made brick. These structures are the architectural manifestations of paranoia. The last fortresses to be built are little more than a century and a quarter old. They were not completed till the 1870s. They belong approximately to the age of Dickens's greatest works and the Crystal Palace and HMS Warrior. Yet their true contemporaries were built centuries before them. They're throwbacks, hugely costly throwbacks devised for several reasons. Lord Palmerston was over 70 when he became Prime Minister in 1855. He was then possessed of first-hand memories of years of war with France. He had entered the House of Commons as the member for a rotten borough only 2 years after Trafalgar. As Foreign Secretary in the 1830s and 40s, he was an enthusiastic meddler in the affairs of other countries. He pursued what would today be euphemized as preemptive actions. He did so because he considered them to be in the British interest, but also because he conceived of Britain as a prefect in the playground of viciously childish nations. The 6 fortresses along Portsdown Hill are known to this day as Palmerston's Follies. Their primary purpose was supposedly to protect the city from a landward invasion, the thinking being that the French would not dare land a force at Portsmouth, but might do so at some unspecified and weakly defended point along the coast and then make their way overland. This was, to say the least, a far-fetched prospectus. The MP, Richard Cobden, recognised that Palmerston was pathetically prey to the fears of his long-distant youth. There is not an officer who is under 50 who does not look with supreme contempt, disgust and humiliation at these works. 140 years on, I guess we are less inclined to be so censorious. Yesterday's folly is today's, well, folly, but in a different sense. Boney was a bogeyman who by night would steal Albion's children and bite their throats out. He was still a bogeyman a century after he died. He has now been replaced by a further crew of antagonistic monsters and fanatical tyrants who foment hatred in their downtrodden people, who create an enemy when there is no enemy. It's not the way we do things in this democracy. A fortress is just such a machine for creating an enemy. And if there's an enemy, we all pull together. Certainly the services require an enemy, and so do those cities which owe their being to the services, Portsmouth chief among them. Its very purpose was, perhaps still is, warfare. It needs wars or engagements or operations or incidents to justify its being.
Portsmouth is a very martial city, and I think it's been shaped by blood and treasure, historically. If you've lived here, you've watched that. You've probably supplied members of your family. When the Falkland crisis blew up, these ramparts here in old Portsmouth were full of mainly women. Yes, there were Union Jacks, people were cheering, but there was a tremendous feeling of foreboding. And I think what that said to me that morning was that Portsmouth was drawing on a deeply embedded historical memory of being the city that sent men to war, and that when you came to pay the butcher's bill, as you inevitably would, then it would be part of the city's blood that would be spilled. There is a deep-bred mistrust, suspicion of anyone who's foreign, particularly if you're French. There was a poll taken in Portsea, and the kids were asked to rank in descending order what they most feared in life. Number 1 were drunk people in the street, number 2 were paedophiles, and number 3 were the French. Anyone who speaks funny, deserves suspicion.
The proposal that the dockyard should, after a break of 40 years, recommence the building of battleships and destroyers suggests that we have learnt nothing from the examples of these tremendous white elephants. Such vessels are already redundant. They're merely future targets for holy warriors who have reinvented the rules of belligerence. They're a gross burden on the public purse. But they're show, all right. They will splendidly adorn that heart-lifting ritual of floating pomp, the Spithead Review. And they will carry on a tradition. The maintenance of tradition is an end in itself. It requires no ulterior purpose. It's analogous to procreation, to breeding, to ensuring species survival. So battleships beget battleships. Defences beget defences. When a defence is built, a dockyard defence, say, it inevitably presents itself as a potential target. It's an incitement to the enemy. And it raises the question of how it should itself be defended. Portsmouth's answer is admirably straightforward. It is to build a further defence to defend the defence. And that further defence will inevitably incite the enemy. So a further defence is required, and so on and on and on and on.
We're in the middle of the Solent in a Victorian fort. She was built many, many years ago, and I came to visit her and fell passionately in love with her. She's just so beautiful, being surrounded by the sea, all the brickwork and the paint, it's just lovely. First time I ever saw her when I was much younger, I was scared of her because she's like this big thing, you know, towering in the sea. But then when I came on board, it was a completely different story. Some people think I'm totally mad, other people think it's fabulous. My mother thinks it's a lump of concrete. So it's horses for courses, really. We used to live here all the time, but in the winter months it became quite hard for me because I had to handle the boat on my own. And if there's really strong winds and the tides are dreadful, I had to land and pick myself out of the water. And it got too stressful for me and wasn't fun anymore. So now I only live here in the summer. And of course it's beautiful then because the sky's beautifully blue and the sea's lovely and it's just a completely different atmosphere.
The fortresses built in Spithead are ingenious and original works of engineering. But the rest of Palmerston's Follies represent the last British examples of the fortress composed of polygonal earthworks, wet or dry moat, glacis, enceinte, keep, caponiers. Once again, buildings development had lagged far behind that of ballistics and munitions, and it understandably failed to take account of aerial warfare. Palmerston's engineers refined and augmented a defence system which had been introduced to Portsmouth in the 17th century and whose foundations were entirely French. They derived directly from the work of Sébastien de Vauban, Louis XIV's prolific engineer. So had the French arrived, which of course they didn't, they would have been repelled by French methods. Francophobia is, of course, still commonplace today. It is apparently perfectly acceptable to write about or talk about the French with a mixture of envy and hatred, which, was it directed at Arabs or Jews, Pakistanis or Indians, would be regarded as inadmissible, actionable. Worse, today's Francophobia is so paltry. At least that of the mid-19th century bequeathed us a magnificent legacy of marvellous monuments, which may have been perfectly useless in their day, but which are now a perpetual delight and a reminder of the wisdom and predictive acumen of great men of state.